Welcome to Unlocking Science. Our goal is to glorify God by studying and unlocking the secrets of His amazing creation. I'm your host, Mr. P, and I'm joined today again by Dr. David Menton, and we're going to be talking about the respiratory system, or as you say it,
Pulmonary.
Pulmonary, okay. And we've got a bit of a potato situation here because sometimes people will say respiratory versus respiratory. And we'll be looking at the way our body breathes, takes in air, and all the important functions and all the features that are there. So you've got a verse on the screen to kind of share with people and get us kicked off here.
Yeah, and the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground. We read in Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. And then the Lord breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. That breath of life is very special, and we're going to be talking about how air-breathing creatures manage to get air into their bodies and out.
Yeah, so when we think about the process of respiration, there's also another biological process of respiration that involves energy exchange and using oxygen inside the cell. But here we're talking about gross respiration, where we're bringing air into our lungs and out of our lungs and all the exchange that happens there. So how exactly does that happen? How has God designed our bodies to let that happen? Well, I've got a grape juice jug here to help you understand that better. So if we think about this jug as a model of how we breathe, this rigid plastic container would represent our rib cage, okay, that wraps around the upper part of our body up here. And inside of the rib cage, this red balloon would represent our lung. And down here, I've got this glove tied off around the bottom, and it represents the muscle at the bottom of our rib cage called the diaphragm. And what happens in breathing is not that we're pumping air into a system, but we're actually creating a pressure difference. So we've talked about pressure in previous episodes. Everything in nature tends to flow from high to low. That's the natural condition that God's created, and that's how things behave. So when I bring this diaphragm up tight in the bottom, we can see the balloon inside there looks pretty flat and deflated. As I draw the diaphragm down, I'm going to create a pressure difference, and that red balloon is going to inflate. We can see it getting larger. The diaphragm goes up, the balloon collapses. So this is demonstrating a difference of pressure inside the lungs and outside, the air around us, and the way the diaphragm pulls. Creating that pressure differential allows our body to breathe and draw air into the lungs. And that's a pretty important process, because if we couldn't do that, we'd be pretty dead.
True. Well, let's see where all of these parts are in a model of the human body. If I may step behind here a bit.
Here's your magic pointer stick if you need that.
This is Algernon. You may have met him before. And we're going to look at Algernon's lungs. I removed some of the model here that had the ribs and the front part of the lung. And you can see the ribs do wrap around the lung very closely. And that's what you just saw in the model. The plastic bottle had kind of little ribs to keep the bottle from collapsing. You want the lung to expand, not the chest cavity to collapse. So let's remove the lung tissue here, and I'm going to remove the other side as well. And you notice there's a notch in the left lung. There's two lungs, a right lobe and a left lobe. And the left one has a notch in it. That's where the heart fits in, so it's a little smaller. Now, where's the diaphragm that goes down and brings air into the lung? It's right here. This gray line going along here is a flat sheet of muscle shaped like a bowl upside down. And that bowl completely seals the body from here on up, from the body from here on down. In fact, blood vessels and nerves that need to get from up here down here have to go through a hole in this diaphragm, in this dome. So if you can imagine now, we inhale, the diaphragm muscle goes down, and when it goes down, it's like on our model, pulling.
Pull down on the muscle here, and it pulls that lower.
That creates a negative pressure, and the opening at the top here can be the nose and the mouth. We can breathe through both, although we recommend you breathe through the nose as much as possible. And another mechanism besides the diaphragm, that's the main muscle to breathe, but also our ribs help us to breathe. If I could have that valuable model over there.
Oh, the pail, yep.
Yeah, we've spared no expense to bring you the best in anatomical models. And we have a blue one in here, that's for later. Notice the handle on the pail. Our ribs are like the handle on this pail. They don't wrap around our body like this. Our ribs go down at an angle, just the way the handle of this pail does. And then we have muscles called the intercostal muscles that are between the ribs. And these muscles can pull this pail handle up, or the ribs pull them up. And notice what happens. When the handle goes up, it creates space in here. And so we not only make our chest cavity deeper or longer by bringing the diaphragm down, but by raising our ribs, all of them kind of collectively, they're hinged so they can come up a bit, we also increase our chest size. You might try sometime just taking a rope or a belt, letting all the air out of your body, and then tighten up that belt. Now try to breathe. It'll restrict your breathing. When Jesus Christ hung on the cross to save us from sin and death and the power of Satan, his arms were held up. That was the standard method, that they would nail the arms up high. And what that does, it pulled all the ribs up so that the chest was expanded, but you couldn't let the air out very easily. Try hanging from a pipe sometime, like you do when you do pull-ups. Hang from a pipe and see how hard it is to breathe, because muscles that you use to elevate your ribs are holding the ribs up in the expanded position. Well, let's look at this all in more detail. The blood vessels coming off the heart, the right side of the heart sends blood through two pulmonary veins into the lung, and in the lung they'll pick up oxygen from all the little branches of these vessels. So we have a pulmonary artery and a pulmonary vein. It's unusual that the pulmonary vein contains the oxygenated blood coming back to the heart. Pulmonary artery going out away from the heart is called an artery because it's going away from the heart, but it has the low oxygen blood. So the blood circulates through the lung and then comes back into the heart in this position here. So it enters the pulmonary trunk. The blood goes into the lungs from the pulmonary trunk, and then returns to the left atrium in 4 vessels on each side. And here you can see them coming in right here, going right into the heart. Notice the branching of the trachea. The trachea is hidden behind the vessels here, and those little white lines are cartilage rings, and they keep these airways from collapsing. You look at a vacuum cleaner hose, oftentimes it has like a spiral spring in it, or a hair dryer hose. It keeps that hose from collapsing when it's under pressure or under vacuum. So let's now look at a little bit more detail here. The lung is sitting inside of a sac called the pleural sac. And the pleural sac can be modeled with this balloon. Ignore the knot. It has 2 layers, and the lung and the heart does the same thing in a cardiac sac. The lung lobes fit like this into this double-walled sac. It's called the pleural sac in the case of the lung. We're just demoing with the heart here. The inner layer is stuck to the lung. The outer layer, and as you know, a collapsed sac like this would have 2 layers. The inner layer is attached to the lung. You can't get it off. The outer layer is attached to the chest wall lining. And what that means is when you're breathing, if that wasn't there, it would be like this. And I'm starting to feel heat from the friction of my hand. But if we had a little bit of oil inside of this collapsed balloon, and we attach the rubber sides to one hand and the other, it would be very slippery. And so, very important, this pleural sac, just as the cardiac sac around the heart, is a double-walled, lubricated structure that allows the lungs to expand and contract without creating friction. This alone would be fatal. If we didn't have the double-walled sac around the heart and our lungs, the beating of our heart and the breathing of our lungs would cause excessive heat.
And that would raise our core body temperature as we talk about that and cause our bodies to overheat. And then that's a very dangerous situation. Now, you may have heard of hypothermia, where your body gets too cold, and that can cause things to shut down and slow down. This would be hyperthermia, where we raise that. Now, you used a word a minute ago I want to stop and think about. You said the word pulmonary, so that's going to be our big science word of the day. When we talk about anything pulmonary, that's always something that has to do with the lungs and our breathing system. So that's a key word that we need to know and we'll hear in lots of different scientific contexts.
Absolutely. Let's in fact look at a few uses of the word pulmonary up here. Here is the whole respiratory system. I take my pointer here,
right.
I can
There
do
you
a
go.
little pointing. The air comes in through the nose and through the mouth. We try to breathe through our nose as much as possible. When the air comes in through the nose, this is the inner surface of the nose, and in the back here there are three like shelves that stick out from the wall, just like shelves attached to a wall. These are called kalhh, or turbinates. And these shelves are made of bone, so they don't collapse, but the surface is covered with what we call a mucosa. And it has lots of blood vessels in it, and it has mucus-producing cells. It has cilia, the little hairs that beat to move the mucus within this area. And this shelf works like a radiator, the kalhh. As the air comes in, it preheats the air, and it also humidifies the air. It gets damp. We don't want to dry out our lungs and airway. All warm-blooded creatures have kalhh, or turbinates, just like we see here. In cats, they're really elaborate labyrinthine structures. What's interesting is people say dinosaurs were warm-blooded, but there isn't really a great deal of evidence for that, except they believe that dinosaurs are birds and birds are dinosaurs. I don't accept that. But nobody has found these kalhh or turbinates in a dinosaur, but we do find them in birds and mammals. So once the air is passed through this area, it comes down. Let's go to higher power. A little more detail here. Here we go. There's our kalhh, or turbinates here. The air comes in, and it goes into our nasal cavity here. And down here we get into an area called the pharynx. And we have a nasopharynx up in here near the nose, and we have an oropharynx near the mouth. And there, notice the airway from the nose and the airway or foodway from the mouth come together right here in the what we call oropharynx. Now again, evolutionists are critical of that. They say if there was a God, he wouldn't have made it that way. Well, they're overlooking something. The problem, according to the evolutionists, is that sometimes when we're eating food, the food can come down and get into our trachea, the airway, which begins right down here in the just below what we call the laryngopharynx, get into the larynx. And air comes down and goes here. Food comes down and goes down the esophagus, which is behind the larynx. And once in a while, if you get eating too fast or aren't thinking, you get something in the trachea and you have to expel it by coughing or something like that. Evolutionists have suggested that if there was a God, he would have had a separate opening for the air to breathe with from the mouth. But what would be the problem with that? We wouldn't be able to talk. You probably didn't think of this as being one of the functions of our lung. We all know that it exchanges gas, CO2, oxygen, but without lungs, without air coming out of our body, we can't speak. Right down in here, we get into the larynx where we have the vocal cords. And the vocal cords, have you ever tried this little trick? Get two blades of grass and hold the two blades of grass together between your fingers so they're like side by side here, and then blow into those two blades. They vibrate against one another and makes a squeaky sound. Just be glad you don't sound like that. But we have vocal cords that work that way. When the air comes up, they vibrate. To show you how important this is, try holding your breath. See how long you can hold your breath. See, like, I won't do it now because we don't want to take that much time. Now, do it again after you've held your breath and timed yourself how long you can comfortably hold your breath. The next time, take in a breath, and now start counting as fast as you can count. So you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. See how long your air lasts when you're counting. You're using air to make the sounds of the numbers, and so you can't hold your breath quite as long as when you're just simply not expending air at all. So let's go from this model to the lungs. This tube coming down is called the trachea, and the trachea has little rings in it, and those rings are made of cartilage. Cartilage is like what we have in our nose that makes it stiff, or in our ear. And cartilage helps to keep these rings open so they don't collapse when we create negative pressure in our lungs by moving the diaphragm down. And here is the diaphragm, right in this area here. So when that goes down, the ribs get pulled up, the lung becomes expanded with air by way of what we call a respiratory tree. And doesn't it look like a tree upside down? You have a trunk, you have branches. By the way, notice the branches here. These are called bronchi, primary bronchi. They're the airways that go right into the lung. We have a left bronchus and a right one here. Once in a while, children will get a peanut or something in their nose and aspirate it. And don't ever do that. Just don't put any object like that in your nose. But it can come down the trachea, and more likely than not, it's going to go into the right lung, because this is a straighter shot than into the left. Well, here you can see the bronchi. They divide, and as long as there's cartilage in the wall, we call it a bronchus. So 3 generations or branchings of bronchi. Finally, we get down to little tiny tubules that are called bronchioles, and bronchioles don't have cartilage in the wall. But bronchi and bronchioles do have muscle in the wall that can adjust the size of the airways, and also there's elastic tissue. And the elastic tissue is what allows the lung to go, when it gets expanded, you want it to go back down again. And so the elastic recoil causes it to relax again. In a normal rate of breathing, we breathe about 12 to 16 times a minute. You might want to time that sometime, just how many breaths you make. Now try running around the table or maybe around the block a couple of times, and then measure your breath. It'll be at a higher rate. It'll go up to 40 to 60 breaths per minute. When you were just a newborn baby, you were breathing at about 40 to 60 as your normal rate. But as we get older, we don't require that much breathing. You get down to 12 or 16 breaths. Well, let's look a little deeper in the lung, look at some further detail. Finally, we get to the smallest bronchioles. These little bands represent muscle and elastic tissue in the walls. And instead of having just an airway that conducts air called a respiratory tree, because it looks like a tree upside down, we, at the next level, get into these little bubbles here, and they're called alveoli. And this is where the gas exchanges, where we take CO2 from breathing out, that gets removed, and oxygen comes into the blood vessels, oxygenated blood. And this blood, of course, contains hemoglobin. That will bind to the oxygen. Why do we have hemoglobin? This is an interesting story here. You ever drink water that's the same temperature as your body? Try that. Take some water out of the tap. You can feel how warm you are here, just like this. Get it that warm. Now drink the water. What does it taste like? It tastes flat. And the reason it tastes flat is not much oxygen can dissolve in warm water. So we prefer cold water. It has more oxygen in it. Now, our blood is warm, so what are we going to do to get oxygen dissolved in our blood to go out to our big toe from our lung and heart? We have hemoglobin, a protein that binds the oxygen. So we can carry a much bigger load of oxygen than if we were just relying on blood to, like oxygen in water. So coming down here, we have a whole series of things. Respiratory ducts are ducts where we begin to get these little alveoli. This is an alveolar duct, which is a duct that basically just has one bubble after another in its wall, all involved in gas exchange. We get to the end, we call that, it's sort of like a cul-de-sac in your neighborhood. It's called the sac, the alveolar sac. Now here are the blood vessels that are supplying the lung. This blue vessel will, of course, be an artery coming in because it's coming from the heart and it needs oxygen. In the wall of the little alveoli, and by the way, alveoli are shaped like a breakfast food bowl. They're like this. And you just have thousands and thousands of them. In fact, the surface area of all these little sacs we breathe through would be approximately that of a tennis court, if you could just measure the whole area. So we have blood on one side of that membrane, the size of a tennis court, and blood on the other, but high oxygenation on one side, low on the other. So when the blood returns from the wall of the sac, where the gas exchange occurs, across a very thin layer of cells called type 1 pneumocytes. They're so thin you really can't even see them in the light microscope. You mainly just see the capillaries in the wall. Then the blood returns by means of the pulmonary vein, and it will go back to the left side of the heart. And here you can see it's oxygenated and red in color. Well, this is an actual picture of lung, a photograph I took through the microscope. And I just happened to hit all the ducts that we're talking about. All the little spaces here, those are the alveoli. And that's where gas exchange occurs. The walls that show up as kind of red lines, that's because of capillaries in the walls. If the capillaries that conduct blood weren't there, you probably wouldn't even see these sacs. So air comes in a bronchiole that has muscle and elastic tissue in it. It has little cilia that beat so that any mucus that forms in the lung that picks up dust will be taken up to our oropharynx, where we have two choices, swallow or spit. It's gross but true. Here we start to get into pathways, the alveolar duct here, where you see one alveolus after another. Notice it's open so the air can go from the duct up inside. You say, well, what about this duct here? It doesn't seem to open up into anything, or this alveolus. That's the plane of section. We have to have just the right plane of section to catch the bowl so we can see it open. And so we've done that right here, and here, and here. So gas exchange occurs at this important location. And these are alveoli, a term you ought to put in your memory bank. Finally, here's a picture I took through the microscope of a thick section of lung. And these circular areas are the alveoli. But look at the area like this. It looks kind of branching red lines here. These are the capillaries in the wall of a glomerulus. So this is one glomerulus with its capillaries. This is another. You say, what about here? There's nothing. Plane of section again. We missed the layer of capillaries. Well, I think the Lord deserves praise for this wonderful respiratory system. And here in Psalm 150, verse 6, let everything that has breath praise the Lord. Praise the Lord indeed.
All right, so if we think about the main function of the lungs, the most important thing in my mind is we need to get oxygen into our blood so it can get into our cells so they can use that oxygen in the energy exchange process. That's the cellular respiration. And as a byproduct of that, that creates carbon dioxide and other waste products. Those go back into the blood, and those are going to come back to the lungs, and then that's exhaled. So when we're inhaling, the main goal is to get oxygen into our bloodstream and get that out to the rest of the cells in our body. And when we're exhaling, we're getting rid of that carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide at too high of a concentrations in our blood can be very dangerous.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. You know, there's another name for that, breathing in and out. It's called tidal respiration. And isn't that a good name for it? It's like the tide.
Yeah.
The air comes in, it goes out. And why is that? Because the alveoli, the little sacs at the end that have this huge surface area like a tennis court, but they're tiny, each individual. Those little alveoli are like a sac. The air goes in. What's the only other way out? The same way you came in. You have to go back up the respiratory tree. And so air comes in and air is going out, and we call that our breath. And as I say, we do that about 12 or 16 times a minute. Mm-hmm. And think of this, what kind of muscles are we breathing with? There's three kinds of muscles. There's skeletal muscle under voluntary control. Mm-hmm. There's smooth muscle like in our intestines that we don't have to think about, and I'm glad about that. I hate to have to think about all that. Or the uterus, in the case of women, that's smooth muscle. It can contract all day. Mm-hmm. But and then cardiac muscle, which beats automatically.
And that's found in our heart.
Right. The smooth muscle and the cardiac muscle we call involuntary. We normally would not have control over that.
Yeah.
But skeletal muscle, I mean, I can do this when I want to, right?
Yes.
I don't just sit here talking and all of a sudden, oh my goodness, get it done. No, that doesn't happen. But yet, do you really think about your breathing?
Not really, but I can if I want
Can
to.
if you want.
And that's an interesting paradox of that muscle group.
I'll bet you most of the kids out here watching this have been watching the whole program without ever once really thinking about, now it's time to inhale.
Absolutely.
Now it's time to exhale. What if God had made us that way? What if he would have said, look, I don't know how much more I can do for you. I've given you lungs and the heart, and it'll oxygenate the blood. Anytime you want air, you just inhale. And when you want to get rid of it, exhale. And then if he said, see you later, and walked off, wow, we'd be in big trouble.
I'd probably get distracted thinking about something else and forget to breathe, knowing the way I think sometimes.
And what if you fell asleep?
Yeah.
That'd be the end of us. Think of it. Voluntary muscles. You are in control. Try it, everybody. Inhale. Exhale. See, you're in charge. But now, if you forget about it, it just runs automatic. Oh, that would be the worst torture on the face of the earth if we were put in charge of our own voluntary breathing using our voluntary muscles.
Now, another way we can think about that automatically working, when our body is active, let's say we're exercising or running or getting chased by a bear, something exciting, that rate of respiration, our breathing, goes up because our body sends signals to our lung or to our brain back to our lungs that says we need more oxygen to make this work out good. And so those things are produced at a higher rate and our respiration rate goes up.
Absolutely. You know, the lung does some things most people never ever think about. I mentioned speech.
Yeah, that's pretty
we
important.
couldn't speak without the air coming through the airways from our lungs. People get a tracheotomy where they go into the trachea temporarily for medical reasons, and they can't speak until that is removed. But how about this? The lungs are also involved in adjusting the pH of the chemistry of our body. The lungs produce a hormone that's very important in the kidneys, in what we call the renin-angiotensin system that controls salt concentrations being excreted. So the lung is doing a lot of things besides just bringing in fresh air.
Yep. Now here's kind of a fun involuntary reaction that happens in our bodies that we can kind of end the episode on here. If we think about this as our diaphragm, one of the ways that our body acts involuntarily sometimes is with hiccups.
Right.
And with a hiccup, what's happening is you're getting a spasm of that diaphragm muscle. Just like you might, sometimes you'll get a little twitch in your eye or in your arm, those muscles can start to spasm and twitch. A hiccup is basically a rapid contraction and relaxation of that diaphragm. And if that balloon's gonna go, it's gonna pop real quick. And as this keeps contracting, it gets annoying to us and we can't stop that most of the time. So that little popping action of the diaphragm, that rapid contraction, that's what causes us to have hiccups. So have you found a cure for hiccups yet?
I've tried this one. Take a paper sack and breathe in and out into the paper sack, and that tends to
Relax that.
relax it. Or just hold your breath for long periods of time.
If you can catch that within the first 1 or 2 hiccups and hold your breath for as long as you can, that'll usually stop it. But I've heard all kinds of things like standing on your head and drinking water and all kinds of crazy stuff.
And not only can the air come in through a hiccup and be embarrassing, but the air can come out.
And make funny
As a
noises.
belch.
Yes.
And there we have extra air kind of stored in our airways and places in our lung, and it suddenly is released, and we oftentimes give it a little help by expressing the air. And by the way, the lung is elastic, so it's like our balloon. You have to expand it with negative pressure, but it will collapse on itself because it has a rubbery type connective tissue called elastin. But sometimes we force air out. And when we do that, that's not just elasticity. We're using another muscle, and the muscle we use, you know what they call the six-pack? I could rip off my shirt and demonstrate, but we'll spare that. The six-pack, those abdominal muscles there, when they contract, help us to expel air forcibly.
Yeah, because you're pulling that body down and that's pressing the organs up into the diaphragm and up to the lungs. All right, you can see how amazing the design of our bodies is, thinking about the way God has given us all of these different tools and the way that we have to have this lubricating sac around the lungs so we don't get too hot, the way the pieces branch, the capillaries, all of these things working together with our nervous system. It's an amazingly complex process, and it is something we can give praise to the Lord for as we think about all of these things. All right, we thank you for joining us for this episode, and until we see you next time, get out and explore all of God's amazing creation.